Hello, everyone. I'm Fred Murphy. I work with the Marxist Education Project, and we're very happy to have you here for a talk by Alan Wald on the state of emergency in U.S. higher education. Alan is a longtime scholar and activist. As Professor Emeritus of English Literature and American Culture at the University of Michigan, Alan is a member of the UM Faculty and Staff for Justice in Palestine and a member of the National Academic Council for Jewish Voice for Peace. He has authored 9 books on the U.S. literary left and related topics, and he's an editor of the journals Against the Current and Science and Society. So Alan is going to talk for maybe 35, 40 minutes, and then we will have plenty of time for questions, comments, and discussion on this topic. Alan, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, many thanks, Fred, and to all the organizers of the Marxist Education Project for arranging this discussion of the state of emergency in higher education. We are obviously in some kind of broad spectrum crisis that's, escalating every single day. But I think the important point to remember is that it was precipitated by something, and it's still largely taking place through that something, and that something is what many people are calling the anti-Semitism scare. That is, there was a pretext for this assault on student rights and academic freedom for faculty, and it was started by Democrats and Republicans who targeted pro-Palestine speech and action with an exaggerated claim. The claim was that these constituted some kind of epidemic of anti-Semitism, which was rampant on university and college campuses, and it was an epidemic that endangered the safety of Jewish students. So, yes, they are blaming the Jews for their acts of repression and cutbacks. That's the name of the game here. And if after last year, some people were still waiting for the other shoe to drop, well, the shoe has now dropped, and frankly, it's a jackboot. So I think calling the political climate today the anti-Semitism scare makes a lot of sense because there's so many extraordinary parallels in this dynamic with the Red Scare of the 1950s. Now, of course, I can't cover everything, so I'm going to focus mainly on what's happening with university and college faculty. I know faculty are not the only or even the most important targets of the harassment today because students are being criminalized, detained, deported. I think over 100 have had their visas revoked without any kind of due process. Entire academic programs are being put in receivership. DEI, which stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion, is being wiped out. Millions of dollars for scientific research is being defunded, and so on. But the faculty situation is what I've been writing about, and it connects with my work on the Academic Council of Jewish Voice for Peace and the Faculty and Staff for Justice in Palestine group, which is actually affiliated with a national organization, and also the American Association of University Professors, of which I'm a member. So you may want to have some follow-up sessions on these other specific aspects. But the first question I want to address is, have we been here before? And my answer is yes. There are certainly some novel and curious features to what's going on, but the anti-Semitism scare is far from the first right-wing assault on universities and academic freedom. So we're not on entirely unfamiliar terrain. And about these earlier dark chapters in U.S. history, there are at least 3 things that we should have learned with some certainty. The first is that once a period of political repression indisputably sets in, the situation only gets worse. As soon as a witch hunt gets going, it never stops at the original targets. The second is that the advent of such a dreadful era usually comes as a slope and not a switch. So preventative action may still have hopes of moderating that subsequent slide when it happens in the earlier stages. The third thing is, when you're faced with a bully, what gets rewarded gets repeated. So deference only teaches power just what it can get away with. The pre-capitulation of the right to the right that we've seen by almost every college and university since October 7th, 2023, has only put blood in the water. And that encourages more shark attacks. And my apologies here to any sharks who might be offended by a comparison with the henchmen of the Trump administration. And yet the problem is now, 7 months following the 2025 presidential inauguration, many of our colleges and university colleagues exhibit a kind of murkiness in their assessment of how they should respond. Faced with a possible loss of federal funds, they're not willing to dip into their billion-dollar endowments, as they did during COVID, or to fight back on the legal front where everybody knows that the cases would be very strong. Many are acting like deer caught in the headlights. They can't see that this is the most blatant assault on academic freedom and free speech that we've experienced since the 1950s. And because after all, the basic meaning of academic freedom under the First Amendment is that politicians do not have the right to, missing a page here. Sorry. Do not have the right to control what is taught, who is hired, who is fired, and so on at the universities. That's simply the right of the faculty members themselves. So, since I'm speaking in a Marxist venue today, I'm sure I don't have to remind anyone about the importance of the introductory sentence of Frederick Jameson's 1981 book called The Political Unconscious. That sentence is always historicize. And when I historicize, I see a disturbing context for this current multi-front assault on academic freedom. Basically, today we're looking at a U.S. national shift to the right that's part of a worldwide swing toward reactionary and religious nationalism. Mostly it's toward Christian nationalism, but not all. This is a reshaping of the global order. It's not only in Europe, where we see leaders such as Meloni in Italy, Orban in Hungary, Kickl in Austria, and organizations such as the National Rally Party in France and the Alternative for Germany. It's also worldwide, Modi in India, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Milei in Argentina, Bukele in El Salvador, Netanyahu in Israel. That is, it's also imperative to add that when Frederick Jameson began that book with the slogan, always historicize, he followed it. He followed it by asserting that this watchword was itself, quote, a trans-historical imperative. That is, there are patterns and the types of thinking and behavior that gain ascendancy following certain types of historical events. And that's why I began by asking, have we been here before? Because just as we can see a family resemblance between what's happening in the US and the evolution of an international right, there are also signs of something else. And that's a similitude in academic thinking and behavior from earlier moments when our freedom to speak and teach critically was under assault. So let me just present a quick review of some of the repressive acts against faculty since the fall of 2023. So you'll know what I'm talking about. And also because these older episodes are being sort of obscured, even forgotten under this onslaught of new events. If you recall Stephen Thrasher, he held the chair of social justice at Northwestern University. He had his classes canceled after he participated in an encampment demanding divestment from Israel. This was April 2024. Steve apparently collaborated in trying to set up a protective line between the police and his students, and he was therefore charged with obstructing an officer. Northwestern University announced plans to investigate his social media, but now he's actually lost his job. Richard Heyman, H-U-Y-M-A-N, he's a longtime lecturer at the University of Texas at Austin. He was fired by email after police charged him with shouting expletives at a protest and gesturing in a, quote, threatening manner with his water bottle, which we know is a terrible instrument. Ruha Benjamin, she's a professor of African American studies, and she's a MacArthur Fellow at Princeton University. She's still being investigated for her pro-Palestine activism. Catherine Franke, she's a distinguished Columbia law professor. She was forced to leave her position following an investigation sparked by the comment she made on Democracy Now! In an interview. where she expressed concerns about the harassment of pro-Palestine activists by former soldiers from Israel who were studying at Columbia. Then there's Tiffany Willoughby Herod. She's a University of California Irvine professor of global international studies. She was charged with 3 misdemeanor counts, including allegedly resisting arrest at the time of a pro-Palestine protest in May 2024. Professor Michel de Graaf at MIT, he has received letters of reprimand, and a pay raise has been withheld after he disputed with his department about a request in 2023 to teach a course on the Israeli-Palestine conflict. There's also a justice studies professor, Sanghia Kil, K-I-L, at San Jose State University, California, who has been suspended since May 2024 because of her involvement as an advisor to pro-Palestinian student groups on campus. And of course, many of you know about Maura Finkelstein. She's a tenured chair of anthropology department at Muhlenberg College in your neighbor, New Jersey, who was fired in May 2024 due to her social media posts about Zionism, which some people said were offensive to Jews. So what we can see here is that campus administrators, long before Trump, were focused on carrying out repression against pro-Palestine activism in several ways. One was to institute new restrictions on campus protests. These are rules not previously enforced, and some were not even on the books. Another was to feed whatever forms of faculty and student consultation had existed on the campus through the wood chipper. A third, and I think the most dangerous, was to carry out punishments and even dismissals by claiming that the administration was protecting the, quote, safety of Jewish students. Now, this last deception, it's engineered under Civil Rights Act Title VI, which you should know about. The strategy is to treat any outspoken anti-Zionist opinions, and especially certain slogans, phrases, and ideas, as anti-Semitic discrimination against a supposed, quote, protected class due to race, color, or national origin. And so the allegation is that the anti-Zionism in one statement or in one slogan, it's not understood to be the targeting of an ideology or a state policy, which, it's normally the intention. It's alleged to be aimed at harassing a, quote, protected class of students due to their national origins. And the key phrase here, national origins, is supposed to refer to one's country of birth or ancestry, as well as physical, cultural, or linguistic characteristics. So the deception is to act as if the political ideology of Zionism actually denotes anyone Jewish, even though, of course, most Zionists in the United States are not Jews. They're Christian Zionists, and they outnumber Jews by far. There's probably 30 million organized Christian Zionists who control the Israel lobby, and there are about 5 million Jewish adults, and not all of these Jewish adults are Zionists by any means. Nevertheless, by weaponizing this false conflation, Zionist equal Jew, an extortion scheme becomes operable. If a university fails to act against violations of Title VI, that is, if they don't act in response to someone's claim of harassment or a hostile environment, it can be punished by losing millions of dollars in federal funding. So this means that when politicians want to neutralize a campus where there has been progressive political activity, and that's also often the case because there are a large number of Jews on the campus, there is financial motivation for university administrations to find new methods for disciplining people in order to avoid losing their funding under Title VI. Moreover, many of the alleged Title VI violations that have received attention are based on complaints about the personal social media of faculty, which customarily is seen as extramural speech that ought to have First Amendment rights. What's happening is that individuals and organizations, sometimes these are outsider groups like Betar or whatever, sometimes they're students, they're monitoring the accounts of suspected faculty searching for political ammunition, and then they report to the university that the content they observed made them feel emotionally uncomfortable and anxious. You know, they weren't physically threatened, they just felt anxious. And this enables an accusation that the professor's speech or writing, extramural, intramural, whatever, negatively impacts a student's access to education. And there are additional alleged violations of Title VI that are ascribed to pro-Palestinian faculty due to some distorted characterizations of the readings they assign for their courses, the things used in the classroom. One supposed anti-Semitic critique is the assessment of the Palestine-Israel historical conflict through the framework of a colonialism known as settler colonialism. And this is falsely represented by supporters of the Israeli state as a call for the annihilation of the Jewish population. Another critique, which they say is anti-Semitic, those who reject the present-day Israeli state form as a lawful type of self-determination, not because of an objection to self-determination by a state that is Jewish, but because authentic self-determination does not mean displacing the majority of an indigenous population and then instituting apartheid against them. Thus, when anti-Zionists argue for the normalization of the Israeli state into some kind of modern pluralistic democracy, pro-Zionists experience the equivalent of an anaphylactic reaction because they imagine that they're hearing only, quote, the destruction of the Jewish state. Nevertheless, the major spokespersons for the anti-Zionist left have made it clear from the get-go that it's not the destruction that's the goal, it's creating state forms with equality and not ethnic supremacy. What the evidence shows is that those protests and scholarly approaches that deeply contest the Zionist and pro-Israel position are the ones that are being proscribed as, quote, anti-Semitic, and especially ones indicating that the current events in Gaza and so on are not an aberration, but more of a realization of Zionism. And the object is to make this alternative understanding of this history taboo. Instead, what is most often being promoted are variations of the view that the bloodshed in Israel is a product of the centuries-old longest hatred of Jews, as well as the furtherance of Holocaust-type anti-Semitism. And this reduction of the matter of Jew hatred, of the whole matter to Jew hatred, creates a frame of mind that leads to an exaggeration of one's discomfort, especially if one was raised in a narrow community that only heard good things about Zionism and so on. It means that someone who is pro-Zionist will perceive strident criticisms of the Israeli state as imperiling to Jews as Jews, and unclear chants such as, from the river to the sea, or symbols of solidarity such as Palestinian flags or keffiyehs, or just unfamiliar language like intifada, which means shaking off. These are inaccurately processed as menacing and intimidating. So yes, some people might favor alternative approaches to educating the public that don't involve militaristic sounding beating of drums and waving of flags or using terms that can easily be misrepresented. And we can discuss here what's effective and what's not effective. But none of these chants and icons meet the standard of actionable hate speech or can qualify as in any way punishable unless they're combined with an imminent threat of physical harm. So, in my view, this 5-alarm fire situation for scholars is probably best encapsulated in the growing acceptance of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. It's becoming the norm now at Harvard and other schools, and the Congress may approve it. Really, it's an affront to those of us who live in the reality-based community, because 7 of the 11 examples of anti-Semitism are generally seen to be about criticisms of Israel and not about anti-Semitic acts. This is in spite of the fact that all the scholar research I've seen confirms that the vast majority of anti-Semitism in the US is evident among young men on the political right. They pick it up through social media. They hold conspiratorial and prejudicial views of Jewish people. And all of the research shows that there's relatively little anti-Semitism on the left, where it's criticism of Israeli state behavior toward Palestinians that's the main concern. More seriously, in this definition, it says that to describe the Israeli state's policies and practices, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, as racist, which is accurate, isn't it? That's considered anti-Semitic. So it deprives us of a tool we need to analyze and eventually resolve the situation. It also says that if you make any comparison between Israeli state policy and practice with the behavior of Nazi Germany, that's also anti-Semitic, even though you see that all the time in the Israeli press. Well, there's lots of other problematic issues at work in the evolving university culture beyond what I can get to. But there's no doubt that the type of political repression that I've been describing is at the forefront of this assault on academic freedom and free speech. And it's getting more serious as we get deeper into 2025. On the one hand now, the Trump administration has just launched investigations into a group of some 60, 65 universities on the grounds that, quote, widespread anti-Semitic harassment has been reported. So let's be clear. The reference is not to, several or a dozen anti-Semitic incidents, because these things could have happened. I'm not denying that. But it's referring to, quote, rampant, quote, virulent, quote, relentless anti-Semitism on the campus. This is a bonkers exaggeration, and it's surely intended to frighten faculty and administrators across the country because they now fear they'll lose billions of dollars in federal funding if they do not demonstrate their compliance by cracking down with even more draconian measures against speech and protest around Palestine. At the same time, the Trump regime's attack on DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, it's also underway. And the claim there is that the promotion of anti-Semitism has been part of DEI activity because it promotes education around racism and colonialism and oppression, systemic racism, and so on. So we could talk now about comparisons of today with the World War I Red Scare. There was a little Red Scare, 1939-41. There was the 1990s attack on political correctness and so on. But the closest similarities today are found in the repression of universities in the post-World War II era, which is popularly known as McCarthyism. It's actually Trumanism, but it's called McCarthyism. The context at that time was the decline of New Deal politics that was set off against the rise of Cold War reaction. And the context today is, I think, the legacy of post-2008 activism on behalf of millennial socialism, Occupy, trans rights, Black Lives Matter, and Palestinian solidarity set off against the rise of the new international right. And the pattern of academic repression is disturbingly similar. First, in the 1950s, the federal government took the initiative by sending their agents to universities and threatening them with consequences if they didn't, quote, clean up their house. Then the university administrators announced that they would defend academic freedom and free speech from communist conspirators by firing those who did not cooperate in public congressional hearings. And today, we see the same pre-capitulation and anticipatory obedience playbook, which is handing over power before one has to adjust one's behavior, before one has to. That is, adjusting one's behavior before you're faced with actual coercion. The federal government, and this was under Biden-Harris, they started things off with threats. They hauled the elite college presidents before Congress in 2023. And immediately afterwards, the administrators at universities across the country barreled ahead to clean their house, starting the repression and leaving Trump now to simply kick down an open door in 2025. Also similar then and now is the weaponization of key terms of demonizations, a new identity for a supposedly subversive person. A, quote, communist in the 1950s became a free-floating signifier to mean an agent of Stalin, a conspirator, a potential spy, disloyal citizen, even if the targeted faculty member had merely signed some petitions or had even separated from the Communist Party many years before. And today, a targeted, quote, anti-Semite refers to all sorts of critics of Zionism, including religious Jews, who supposedly create this hostile environment that violates Title VI. Of course, there's no doubt that actual Jew hatred is growing in the West. It's something that has to be stamped out. Anti-Semitism is hateful. It's not a delusion. And we can see its presence in many places. Just recently in the support of MAGA leaders for the neo-Nazi Alternative for Germany party, and then these Nazi salutes and puns that Musk and others have made. But it debilitates the fight against the powerful state-backed anti-Semitism of today if one redefines anti-Semite as being synonymous with anti-Zionist criticisms that come from student activists. It is simply not Jew hatred to take on what has become, in its practice, a supremacist ideology with a racist ethno-state political form as exists in Israel. Anti-Semitism is much too serious a matter for us to allow the anti-Semites themselves to be the ones defining it. In fact, so far as I can tell, people can correct me if they see it differently, when it comes to most of these accusations of left anti-Semitism that I read in the Columbia Report and so on, we have a mix of gross oversimplification, cherry picking, and personal interpretation that is presented as fact. And all of these enable genocide denialists to commit definitional theft. Their definition of anti-Semitism is not about accuracy, it's about domination. And it's really truly painful to see so many liberals, anti-Trump liberals, voicing the same kind of defamatory distortions, claiming that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, that these protests are pro-Hamas controlled, and so on. In the new article about Columbia University in the Atlantic, a New Yorker anti-Trump staff writer, Franklin Foer, F-O-E-R, he's well known, he vomitously refers to the protests against genocide in Palestine as, quote, anti-Jewish activism. This kind of talk from liberals, even if they're against Trump, has helped to propel Trump and his henchmen into power. What is also analogous between the 50s and today is that the assaults on communists and, quote, anti-Semites, they're pretexts for going after much bigger fish. The 1950s witch hunters had two aims. First, they wanted to frighten and discipline the entire campus and the broader public to accept the Cold War strategy of the United States. The right wanted silence and self-censorship ruling the academic culture. Second, the witch hunters wanted to use the, quote, communism issue, just like the anti-Semitism issue today, to beat back existing radical movements as a whole. In the late 40s, in the late 40s, the radical movements were, there was a big labor upsurge. Women were trying to maintain the new status they achieved during the home front on World War II, and it was a growing civil rights movement. And today, of course, we know that there's been increased activity around trans rights, Black Lives Matter, environment, women's right to control their own bodies, and so on. And these are the ultimate goals. And of course, the destruction of the university is also an obvious goal. I can just say that now, reading all what's happened last week with the money withheld from Cornell and everything. They're after universities, largely in the blue states, that they see as an intellectual threat to themselves because they want to transfer academic authority over to these right-wing think tanks, which are in agreement with the Trump administration, the Heritage Foundation, and so on, with its blueprints. So in addition to the things I've already mentioned, there's things that you could compare with the 1950s are snitching and blacklisting, because over the past year, university students were actually coached how to file Title VI complaints, and professors were doxxed on websites, if you're familiar with Canary Mission. And they publish the names of people as a common tactic. Back in the 1950s, it was called red channels. If you had any connection with the communist left, your name was in left red channels. Or maybe if you didn't have a connection, but somebody who wanted to get you fingered you. Um, and in the present time, not only Canary Mission, there's something called Stop Anti-Semitism, which publishes the anti-Semite of the week, who's usually some poor person who criticized Israel and so on. There's also a parallel in producing books that elaborate on the conspiracy thinking. Bestseller in the McCarthy era was J. Edgar Hoover's Masters of Deceit, 1958. In the Trump era, it's the Heritage Foundation has a book called Project Esther, a national strategy to combat anti-Semitism, one of those books that says there's a pro-Hamas network on all the campuses and so on. So none of this is to suggest that the communist supporters in the 1950s had a completely accurate view of the world, especially the Soviet bloc. They were wrong about that, and we can't assume that everybody on Team Palestine or Team DEI is completely perfect today. All dissident movements are comprised of human beings, just like you guys and me. We all have flaws. Our movements can produce individuals and political factions who say and do very counterproductive or just tactless things. I'm not blaming other people here. I'd hate for some researcher to dig up some of the dumb things that I published in my column in the Antioch College student paper in the 60s. We've all made mistakes, but that does not invalidate our cause. What's central to remember is that the firings in the 1950s had nothing to do with the quality of teaching and scholarship, and the witch hunt today is based on a biased and selective targeting of a specific form of political critique, starting with Israeli state and U.S. Approach to Palestine. So let me move into an ending here. What can we do to prevent the kind of full-scale rout that occurred in the 1950s? Because it was a rout in the 1950s. When the national mood changed, things got better, but the defense of the universities was terrible. So obviously, there shouldn't be the kind of pre-capitulation which is already happening. We've got to find ways for unity, and we have to try to win over a majority. And to do that, I think there are two main and somewhat distinct routes. One is to fight repression by creating a greater understanding of the politics of the social movement that's being demonized. Here I'll just focus on the Palestine issue, even though it's defense of DEI and other things are important, but Palestine is the toughest. We have to start by refusing to be the characters that the right wing and pro-Zionists are fabricating. The ones who are making these supposed, quote, anti-Semitic statements that they're claiming that we say. I want to be clear, I think it's only a small number of people who are saying ambiguous things, but the pro-Zionists give these an unfounded meaning, and then they claim that they're a widespread view. And this fiction allows them to be fighting a, quote, anti-Zionism of their own creation. It might feel righteous to start shouting, Zionism is fascism, or say, Zionists not allowed to cross this line and go to class. If you're a Zionist, get off the subway car or something. You may say that's not about explaining what Zionism is. Zionism has a complicated history. There have been several varieties of Zionism. Personally, I reject them all, but I realize it's complicated. If people really understood what Zionism looked like from the standpoint of its victims and what's actually happening in the Middle East, I think we have a chance of achieving a counter-hegemonic shifting of public opinion, as we did on civil rights, Vietnam, South Africa, and gay marriage. In fact, I saw articles today saying that public opinion is shifting on Israel. But this means that there are responsibilities on the part of those of us who support these causes that are under attack. And particularly if you have a priority of stopping the genocide in Palestinians, you've got to be against Palestinians. You've got to be disciplined. If you want to get the United States and Israel off the backs of the Palestinians, so that they can be free to choose their own leadership and own society and so on, you have to put forward your views in a frank, non-arrogant, convincing way. And within our own movement, we have to foster a culture that's open and honest about debating different things. Partisans in support of Palestinian self-determination are not going to be able to build alliances or even a sizable movement if we treat as a traitor those who don't line up with our specific analyses of exactly how one supports the right of resistance. Do you have to support a certain group and hide your criticisms and so on? Regarding Zionism itself, the fact is that most students and probably most faculty in the public, that they have very little understanding of its history and political practice as it's operated in the colonial world. Most people think of Zionism only as a reasonable response to European anti-Semitism. And that does have a plausibility to many people because Jews were not allowed, due to immigration restrictions, to escape to the countries where they really wanted to go. And mainly they wanted to come to the United States. They weren't allowed in due to restrictions that go back to the 1920s. So they had a choice. For many of them, it was to either flee to Palestine as a refugee or die at the hands of the Nazis. So nevertheless, the horrific past of oppression that was experienced by Jews or by any other group can't be used as an excuse for any present-day violations of human rights on a grand scale, especially when you have a nuclear-armed state backed by another nuclear-armed state, most powerful military in the world. To explain the situation with facts, we've got to make full use of teach-ins, op-eds, pamphlets, Zoom classes, radio and TV interviews, selective boycotts, community meetings, dorm discussions, debates, militant but nonviolent sit-ins, die-ins, encampments, intelligent disruptions, civil disobedience, and we also cannot abandon academic courses that treat these issues with thoughtful complexity. That means creating environments where Palestinian voices can be heard and serious scholarly work from all angles on the region, but also on varieties of racism, including anti-Semitism, can be assessed and understood. And as teachers, we know that it's accomplished by imparting and comparing critical tools. And if a university actually forbids these kinds of classes, we should follow our predecessors by setting up our own uncensored freedom schools off campus, in churches, and in union halls. If books become banned because they supposedly violate these IHRA definitions of anti-Semitism, we should defy the bans and make these books available ourselves. Because if we don't use what political freedom we have, we'll surely lose it. The other route to defending university culture is the academic freedom campaign. It's somewhat different. That is, we advocate the right to hold and express our opinions, including the right to demonstrate without being pepper sprayed and roughed up by campus police. And here we can ally with people who don't agree with us on Palestine or don't agree with us on DEI, but who support our rights. Of course, that's not going to happen if we shame them for not going all the way with us or failing to pass our purity tests regarding particular beliefs. So in conclusion, we have to take advantage of the reality that the Trump administration is assaulting so much of our society that there's actually a foundation here for a majority alliance of people at many universities with the community, with the trade unions, in order to fight back. But to do this, we've got to formulate broad demands that really unify, and we've got to stay off the button pushing, provoking, shaming, all that self-righteous stuff. I'm not suggesting that we play down our defense of Palestine's right to self-determination, but all it takes is for one unhinged provocateur to cry out, quote, Zio bitch, or something like that, or raise signs that read, quote, Israel deserves 10,000 October 7th. And the New York Times will publish major opinion pieces that denounced our just cause that is read by millions, and many people believe that stuff, that's typical of our views. Because the right-wing outrage machine then fastens onto these incidents like lampreys. And in the meantime, you could have a faculty and staff for Justice in Palestine group of hundreds of members who work out a well-crafted, thoughtful statement for weeks that goes entirely unnoticed. Now, our job is not to police the left. It's only to work harder at encouraging more effective strategies. What we need to do is promote BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, and education to explain what anti-Semitism actually is, and also the growing right-wing anti-Semitic danger. We also need a national clearinghouse of lawyers to defend victims of repression and organize defense committees. We've got to support groups like Palestine Legal and the ACLU. In regard to global dimensions of these issues, we have to seek out and foster link-ups with parallel movements and co-thinkers in different countries around the world. Finally, and circling back to the anti-Semitism, from anti-Semitism scare to the Red Scare, we have to remember that using American colleges and universities as a case study, there have been many scholars, I'll mention here Ellen Schrecker's work, who have convincingly argued that anything short of a militant rejection of the witch hunt in the 1950s only served as grist for the rationalization producing mills that enabled the administrators to persecute faculty. Then, just as now, at each step, the universities slavishly followed pressure from the right, quickly and shamelessly abandoning any legitimate claim to be havens for dissent, which is what a university should be. These echoes of the past are now becoming deafening because if we let these guys take a chainsaw to the foundations of academic freedom and student rights, there won't be much left for us to stand on.
Okay, thanks again, and see you again soon. Thanks, Alan.
Bye-bye.